Welcome back, everybody. Two things before we get started. If you can like and subscribe, it definitely helps the channel, and I will be eternally grateful for the help that you provided for the channel. Second thing is there are time codes all along the timeline, and there are time codes in the description. If there's anything that you want to see specifically, go ahead and click on those time codes or click on the timeline. You can actually find whatever it is that you're looking for. Obviously, the intent is for the entire video to be enjoyable, but obviously, we're always looking for something specific. So either way, time codes in the description or actual chapter markers on the timeline. Today we have the iPhone 15 Pro Max, and for anyone who's been using an iPhone for a long period of time, the experience that you're getting with the iPhone is pretty consistent year to year. Now, if you're someone who's coming from let's say an iPhone 12 Pro Max or an iPhone 12 or iPhone 11, anything older than the iPhone 12 really at this point, you're getting a whole lot of new features and things that you haven't really seen before or experienced before. But again, if you're someone who is on an every year iPhone upgrade cycle, there's not a whole lot new for you. Obviously, there's going to be some changes and some new additions, but otherwise, the experience, for better or worse, is consistent. Now, I want to run down the list of the new features, quote unquote, new features of the iPhone 15 Pro Max specifically. That's what I'm using, and I've been using it since launch day, September 22nd, 2023. So roughly about 2 months at this point. So first and foremost, based on all the marketing, advertising, the keynote, titanium. Second thing is obviously USB-C, which there wasn't a whole big to do about it, but obviously that's a huge change, especially on the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max. You also have the action button, which is replacing the mute switch, RIP mute switch. You also have the Tetraprism telephoto camera, which we'll get into later. The updated camera focal length, so you have default focal lengths that you can set for the actual main camera, that 48 megapixel wide angle lens. You have ProRes, and then you have ProRes with Apple Log. ProRes is an existing feature, but Apple Log is brand new. For those who don't know what Apple Log is, we'll get into it a little bit later. But for those who actually do a lot of video creation or video editing, Log gives you a lot of the ability to control colors and dynamic range and things like that with the videos that you produce. And last but not least, you have quote-unquote smaller bezels, barely noticeable for 99.8% of the population, including myself. I went from an iPhone 13 Pro Max to the 15 Pro Max, and honestly, that bezel difference is barely noticeable. But either way, let's get right into those features. We'll go, from design, battery, processor, camera, all that fun stuff. We'll go right through it, so let's just jump into it. Now, when it comes to design, Apple doesn't really change the iPhone every year. It's on a tick-tick-tock cycle, so that means that you may have one big redesign. We'll take the iPhone 12 for an example, where that was a big departure from previous iPhones where they had rounded edges and things of that nature to the more squared off edges that was more reminiscent of the iPhone 4, iPhone 4S, and so forth and so on. That design language was around for a while until the iPhone 6. So now at this point, iPhone 13, iPhone 14 were all similar in design. They had sharper edges, stainless steel rails and things of that nature with that matte glass back. Now on the iPhone 15 Pro Max, there isn't a big design change with the exception of more rounded or softer edges around the phone. So on the front of the phone, you still have that ceramic shield glass on the front, and then you have a matte glass on the back, but you have more softer edges going from the front to the side and from the side to the back of the phone. Now, usually with these types of things, I want to talk about materials, but I don't want to spend too much time in materials or make it its own category. But when it comes to materials, the biggest change, the biggest thing that Apple is talking about with the iPhone, and this is the first time the iPhone has ever used this material, but titanium is making its way to the iPhone. The Apple Watch Ultra has been using titanium, and from my first unboxing with that watch to today, not only has it been much lighter in terms of just raw weight, picking up the Apple Watch Ultra out of its box, you had a noticeable difference, especially going from the Apple Watch Ultra to the Apple Watch Series 8 or Series 7 in that stainless steel body. Is a very light material. So when you go into the iPhone 15 Pro Max, you're kind of surprised at how light the phone is. And, just to be specific, you're going from 240 grams on the iPhone 14 Pro Max to 221 grams on the iPhone 15 Pro Max. And so that's not a big difference. Like when you're looking at it at raw numbers, it doesn't seem like a whole lot of a difference, but when you feel it in your hand, giggity, it is a big change in terms of the way the phone feels in your hand, especially with those rounded edges, but also just from a weight perspective. It just feels much lighter. Now, people like to kind of liken weight of a phone or a device or a gadget to quality, and I wouldn't say that the fact the phone is lighter makes it feel any cheaper, but it does feel less substantial in the hand. But you know, it feels like it's just much lighter, especially when you're using an iPhone 14 Pro Max, or for me, the iPhone 13 Pro Max. Overall, in terms of design though, just to kind of come back to where we were, the design iteration on the iPhone 15 Pro Max is very similar to the iPhone 14 Pro Max and similar to the iPhone 13 Pro Max and iPhone 12 Pro Max. There isn't a whole lot that changes. Obviously, again, titanium and softer rounded edges around the front and back of the phone. Now, related to the design of the phone, one big change for the phone, obviously in addition to titanium, and something that isn't talked about a lot, is the action button. The action button is replacing the mute switch, and you know, it's bittersweet because the mute switch kind of wasn't really there for, like, most people keep their phones on silent at this point, myself included. Even my Apple Watch, I keep that on silent. So I want to say the majority of the population probably keeps their phones on silent. Therefore, the need for the mute switch kind of went away. But again, it's that legacy feature that we are all going to miss, just because that's what something that is tried and true. Hardware features kind of trump software features. You know, someone's going to pick a hardware button, so to speak, over a switch. But the action button, in this case, is programmable, and it could become anything that you want it to become. So that means if you want, you know, a whole list of Siri shortcuts programmed to that action button, you can literally map the action button to those Siri shortcuts, whatever that may be. For me, you know, I wish there was a way I can map it to Google Assistant, because I think Google Assistant is, you know, much better at doing basic tasks than Siri is at this point. But either way, the interface for actually changing the action button is very different. It's a big departure in terms of design language from any of the settings in the Settings app. If you go into the Settings app, you go into the action button interface, it gives you all the options in terms of what's available for the action button. There's a plethora of things that are, you know, by default from Apple, but also you have the Siri shortcuts, as I said earlier. But going into that app, you can actually just make it the mute switch, as it has always been. You can make it the camera button, camera shutter. You could make it technically just about anything you want it to be, especially with the power of Siri shortcuts. Now, one thing design related that I wish Apple would have done with the action button is make it orange. On the Apple Watch Ultra, they made it that international orange color. And maybe when we do eventually maybe see an Apple Watch Ultra, which I think is rumored and is probably going to happen at some point, a more rugged iPhone, that action button may be possibly orange. Making a return to the iPhone 15 Pro Max, and severely underutilized, I want to say. Maybe that's controversial. Maybe that's a hot take, but severely underutilized on the iPhone 14 Pro Max is the dynamic island. Now, you can say that, you know, we don't know how much support Apple's going to have with the dynamic island, how far-reaching the dynamic island is. You know, you had the touch bar on the MacBook Pros. That was something that I thought was really cool, but underutilized from developers, not really supported by Apple. But also, you replaced the function row with the touch bar, which just made it a whole hot mess. Fortunately, I was never someone who got the MacBook Pro with touch bar, but I thought it was a cool idea in concept, but not in execution. The dynamic island, I think, is in danger of going that way because there's not a whole lot of support, again, from the developer community, but that's not the developer community's fault. There really isn't a whole lot of applications that really work for the dynamic island, and even Apple themselves haven't really figured out a way to really maximize the usefulness of the dynamic island. At this point, I've used it for sports scores and Best Buy pickups, and I think the Best Buy pickups is really not that useful, but the sports scores is. And for Android users, they've always had the pinned scores. You can pin scores onto your desktop or your home screen for any sport really, and those just pop up automatically without really having to do anything for that score to pop up. It just shows up as a bubble, and then it shows up on your lock screen as well, and in your notification shade. For on the iPhone, it's always in the dynamic island. Problem is though, it's always pinging the information because it's a play-by-play feature, but it's always pinging, and it gives you the warning that your phone is going to basically run through battery because of that feature. So the dynamic island as it is right now is cool in concept, but not really done well in execution. So hopefully with updates, iOS 18 and things like that, or iOS 17, we have some updates or some new features that make more use of that dynamic island and kind of bring over some of the features that we have in Android, like the sports scores or pinning scores, something that doesn't really tax the battery as much as the dynamic island does. Another huge feature of the iPhone 15 Pro Max and Pro are the A17 Pro processors, which is based on the 3nm process and the first of its kind really. But again, that A16 Bionic is making its way to the iPhone 15 base models. The A17 Pro is promising just incredible performance. You know, it's improving in every way, with the one big exception being gaming, where you're seeing the most improvement. And they demoed a game on stage which most people will know, Resident Evil, because it's just a huge franchise. So Resident Evil 7 was demoed in its, all of its console quality glory. A lot of people were impressed with it. Again, I'm not someone who plays video games on my phone. I generally stick to my consoles and play games on those. But again, if you're someone who games on your mobile phone, you're probably going to be seeing some crazy improvements, especially as developers continue to improve the quality of their graphics on their games over the next year or so, especially with the abilities that were unlocked with the A17 Pro. Now, if you were someone who had no knowledge of the iPhone 15 Pro or 15 Pro Max, you would think that the only new thing of those models, especially because of the advertising, is the fact that it comes in titanium, which isn't a feature. It doesn't necessarily change anything about the phone other than its weight. But in reality, you have an incredible processor, which Apple has advertised, especially more recently as of today's recording, which is November 11th. But they also have really chalked up titanium. But one of the big changes has been the camera. On that 48 megapixel main camera, which is a wide angle lens, you have some interesting things happening, which Apple hasn't really talked about much up to this point, and so we're going to talk about it today. On that main lens, the 48 megapixel wide angle lens, you have now 3 default focal lengths. Now, for someone like me, I would call myself, and I don't want to call myself this, but I'm an amateur photographer. I don't even want to call myself a photographer, but I am someone who enjoys taking photos, and that's just something I've always enjoyed doing over the years, starting with the OG iPhone 2G back in 2007, 2008. But you have 3 different focal lengths. You have a 24, a 28, and a 35 millimeter focal length. For me, I've defaulted my iPhone to the 35 millimeter focal length. I have twin 1-year-old boys, and I have a 4-year-old. So having it cropped in a little bit without the loss of quality has been a big improvement for me. Anytime I've zoomed in the past, you notice a degradation of quality in the photo. So for me to be able to crop in, especially because it's cropping in on that main sensor and not zooming in optically or switching over to the previous telephoto lens, you're using the actual main sensor, main lens. And for me, using that 35 millimeter lens has been fantastic. And again, the photos that it has produced have been very, very good. And that's kind of what iPhones have been known for, along with obviously all the Android phones out there. But iPhone specifically has always been big on photography and producing more natural photos. So again, using 35 millimeter focal length, it's been doing a very, very good job, especially with the different filters you can put on as a photo's taken. Additionally, if you're taking photos and you're taking a portrait photo, in the past you had to choose to go to portrait mode. That's no longer a thing. Obviously, it is a thing still. You can still choose to go to portrait mode, but you can actually make your photos into portrait mode, and it is denoted by the little f-stop symbol in the top left corner. After you take a photo, you can actually apply portrait mode to the photo after the fact, and you can choose the density or how heavy that bokeh is. So you can go from, you know, I guess an f1.8 or something like that, all the way up to like a 14 or 20 or whatever the f-stops go up to on the iPhone. But you can adjust the bokeh or the blur in the background as much as you'd like. You can make it as exaggerated as you like, or you can make it as little as you like. And that's an option for you after the fact. In the past, you had to choose portrait mode and take the photo that way. And portrait mode has always been finicky because you had to have enough light. So generally, if you're outdoors is when you're able to take those photos. Now, you can actually just take the photo on the main lens without having to switch to portrait mode and apply the bokeh or the blur after the fact. Like, another big new feature this year is the Tetraprism telephoto lens. So in the past, it was a normal telephoto lens, and it wasn't very good in my opinion. In my experiences, I rarely used the telephoto lens, just because, you know, whenever I did do that 2x zoom, it just didn't look very good, and it was like a lot of artifacts, and even in good daylight, it just still wasn't as good as the main lens. So most of the time, I took 99% of my photos using the main wide-angle lens. On my iPhone 15 Pro Max, I've been using the Tetraprism obviously for testing purposes, but also just to see how good it is. And I want to say it is a big improvement over what we saw. But in terms of zoom quality or zoom features in general, like, I did a little bit of a test going from the ultra wide, which is a 13mm lens, all the way to its furthest zoom, which was a 200mm zoom. And so what I did was the American flag, I kind of just did again in my work parking lot, the ultra wide, and then zoomed all the way in on the flag. And it was just incredible the amount of zoom you get, but the amount of detail that you get on the flag itself. And as you can see, you're going again from the ultra wide, which is just super far out, all the way up onto the details of the flag. Now, a lot of people may see this as a catch-up feature, which in my eyes it is. You know, the super zoom or space zoom that the Samsung Galaxy S series has had, they've had it for quite a while, and I believe from what I'm reading, it's 100x zoom or 2400mm lens or zoom. So obviously the zoom isn't, in terms of quality, isn't the greatest. And neither is it on the iPhone. So when you zoom in, you're going to get a lot of, you know, pixelation and artifacts and things like that. Those photos, for all intents and purposes, I don't think are intended to be photos that you would normally use in, you know, as a, you know, advertisements or whatever you're going to use the photos for. They're not really meant for much more than just capturing a picture, and that's about it, a memory. But it's not meant to be, you know, anything super high quality or reproduced in any way. It's just a quick photo. Rounding out the lenses, you have the ultra wide making its return. That's largely unchanged, and from what the keynote and the advertisements have said, there really isn't much changed with the ultra wide. You do have the macro lens that's also built into there, so you have the macro mode that's offered up to you automatically. You can turn it off by default in the settings for the camera app, but in general, you have the ultra wide, which, you know, does a really good job, especially in really well lit situations, to get an entire scene without a whole lot of like compromise. Around the front of the camera, you have a 12 megapixel true depth camera, or a FaceTime camera, or a selfie camera, whatever you want to call it. It's a fairly decent camera in terms of the photo quality or the photos it produces. Similar to, I believe it is unchanged from previous iPhone models, but again, it does a decent job, and it looks like it notices when multiple subjects are in the photo and makes the photo a bit more of a wide photo so that can fit everyone in there. But in general, the front-facing camera is mostly unchanged or unchanged altogether. 12 megapixels, again, does a decent job of capturing those photos. On the other side of the fence, you have video capture. Video capture has always been one of, you know, Apple's or the iPhone's hallmark features, because it just does video much better than most other phones in the market. It has done good video for a very long time, but the iPhone this year, along with the ProRes that they introduced last year, which is just very high quality video, pro level, you know, quality video, you're actually going to have the ability to record an Apple log. So for anyone not really, you know, into photography or videography, you know, log, you know, every camera brand has it: Canon, Sony, Fuji, Now Apple has log, and what log gives you the ability to do, it basically records in grayscale, but gives you the ability to have like granular control over color. And why that's important is it really gives you the ability to control color and the dynamic range. So if you're recording a scene and you want to kind of accentuate a color specific in that scene, you can do so in Apple log or any kind of log. But you also have LUTs. If you're someone who uses Final Cut Pro, you can use LUTs to kind of have presets in a way, and you can really fine tune the colors that you have and make it to your liking versus, whatever the, color chemistry is for any brand. And every brand has a different color chemistry. I use Sony, but from my understanding, Canon produces very, very good color. But again, Apple log gives you the ability to just have very, very granular control over the color reproduction from the phone in terms of the editing process. Now, when you hear, high quality video or Apple log and ProRes, generally there's always warnings that tells you, hey, this uses up a lot of storage. I believe 1 minute of ProRes footage is clocking in at like 3 gigabytes or 6 gigabytes of data. So that's a whole lot of data. And because Apple included USB-C this year, and on the Pro models you have up to 10 gigabits per second, you can actually attach a external hard drive to the phone itself. So for me, I was able to attach my SanDisk Extreme SSD, this little guy right here. So this is my 1 terabyte SanDisk Extreme. I'm using a 4 terabyte for my video footage and things like that, but I was able to connect this thing directly to my iPhone, and it went from 5 minutes of video playback or video recording, because I'm using a 256 gigabyte iPhone, and I just refuse to upgrade to anything higher than that just because I don't necessarily use it. But because there's USB-C and because there's a higher bandwidth or higher transfer rate in terms of your data transfer, it gives you the ability to attach an external hard drive. And so for me, it went from 5 minutes to something like 2.5 hours of ProRes recording directly to the external hard drive, which is just a game changer. And for anyone who's starting a YouTube channel or doing any type of videography, being able to record directly to a external hard drive just gives you a lot of flexibility, a lot of versatility in terms of what you can and cannot do with your iPhone, which there isn't a whole lot you can't do with it. Now, in terms of video capture, the iPhone, as always, and as predicted, did a very good job of capturing video. For me, I have a set of twin 1-year-old boys, and obviously video and pictures are incredibly important, especially at this stage in their lives. I have a 4-year-old as well, who, they're just constantly moving around, constantly doing things funny or whatever the case may be. But using your phone, whatever the phone is, to capture those moments is invaluable, especially as they grow older and you look back at when they were kids or babies or whatever the case may be. Using your phone to capture those moments is incredibly invaluable. And I think, the iPhone, as always, has done a fantastic job of capturing those moments and organizing it into the library and all that fun stuff. But also, if you're someone who wants to do something a bit more professional, you have that flexibility using ProRes and Apple log to record in those specific formats and just produce higher quality videos. Again, if you're looking to start your own YouTube channel or do any kind of videography, the iPhone is a good place to start, and I think a lot of YouTubers start that way, myself included. We've covered just about everything when it comes to the iPhone. The one thing we haven't covered yet, obviously, is the battery. The battery could be the deal breaker for most people. If the battery isn't what you're expecting it to be, that can kind of change people's minds. And so I went from the iPhone 13 Pro Max, which even with 88% battery life left, was still decent, got to the end of the day with like 30% or so. On the iPhone 15 Pro Max, on the other hand, I thought I was going to get like a day and a half to 2 days of battery life, especially in the beginning when the battery's brand new. But surprisingly, I was getting just about a whole day's worth of battery with about 20% to spare, which again isn't bad, but it's not great. It's not what I expected. I talked about in my Pixel Fold review, I had my Pixel 7 Pro that, using it for an entire day, I get to the end of the day with about 20% left. An iPhone, generally, again, with the iPhone 13 Pro Max, I was making it 2 full days on one charge. And then as the battery starts to age, you don't get that type of battery life. But even toward the end of my, use with that phone, I was still getting a good whole day's worth of battery. With the iPhone 15 Pro Max, and I'm going to say it's probably attributed toward the always-on display and probably toward all these notifications I get and probably toward the dynamic island. But I'm getting a good whole day of use out of it with about 20% to spare at the end of my day, which again, my end of day is about 9 o'clock to 9:30. That's about when I'm going to bed and, dropping the iPhone on the charger. But it's not what I expected. Is it a disappointment? Not necessarily. It's just not what I expected. But for most people, you should be able to get through the whole day. Now, my screen on time is a bit skewed. I started doing a little bit of research. My screen on time usually is about 4 to 5 hours, or even less than that. Like with my Pixel Fold, I was getting about 3 hours of screen on time, and that was partly due to battery, conservation. With the iPhone 15 Pro Max, it was telling me my screen on time was about 6 to 7 hours, but I started researching, and CarPlay actually adds to your screen time, which is a little bit weird because I'm not actually using the screen during CarPlay. But either way, it was telling me I was getting about 6 to 7 hours of screen on time, which is possible that it was depleting my battery as well. But 6 to 7 hours of screen on time on the iPhone 15 Pro Max is decent. Again, real world usage, I was probably getting about 3.5 to 4 hours of screen on time. But 20% left at the end of the day isn't necessarily a disappointment, just not what I expected. And for the purposes of the video, I kept the phone on 5G. iPhone, whether Apple has an agreement with Verizon or whatever the case may be, I have the ability to turn off 5G on the iPhone. And knowing that 5G just chews through battery, especially when it hooks up onto the 5G UW, I choose to usually just stay on LTE because the LTE is usually sufficient for what I do, streaming, audio and things like that, especially during the day at work. A couple odds and ends. One of the big things that I was really happy about, obviously, is USB-C. With the iPhone in the box, it comes with a USB-C to USB-C braided cable. For those of you who are just frustrated or fed up with the iPhone cable just crumbling at the ends, it just, that the rubber at the ends of the cable just always breaks apart, always crumbles, and you end up having wires exposed, which could be a hazard. It's braided cables on the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max with the included charging cable. Now, keep in mind that that's not a cable that does high-speed data transfer. So if you're looking to do any type of high-speed data transfer, you're going to need an appropriate cable. The included cable, it's not going to, accomplish that for you. A big controversy that popped up during my testing, but did not affect me specifically, was overheating for the phone. A lot of people were reporting that their phones were getting extremely hot for no specific reason. One person had Instagram open and just kind of, had a temperature gauge on the back of the phone. It just went up something like 10 to 15 or 20 degrees while Instagram was open. Apple did acknowledge the issue, and from what I have read and heard, it seems that they have resolved the issue. Me personally, I never ran into that problem. I use Instagram. I guess that's pretty much my only social media app, Instagram and Threads. But either way, the phone for me never really overheated or anything like that, but I know there was a large population of iPhone 15 or 15 Pro Max users that were running into the overheating problem. I'm going to end the odds and ends part of this with the always-on display. The always-on display was something I never had before with an iPhone. I did mention in my Pixel Fold review that the always-on display on the iPhone, I just think wasn't done quite right. I think a lot of the information should be centered in the middle of the phone. I know what Apple was going for, which was your lock screen, but always on. And so all the information is in the same place as you would expect it. But I think for a always on display to be useful, I think the information needs to be front and center. All the pertinent information, battery life, songs that are playing in the background, or time, weather, those all should be clustered in the middle of the phone, easy to read. for me, everything's, and for everybody else in terms of the iPhone, all that information is kind of stacked up at the top of the phone. And then the battery percentage isn't displayed at all. But I just feel like it would be infinitely more useful, centered in the middle of the screen, stacked or designed however you want, but just easily accessible at a glance versus having to find all that information. Again, I applaud, Google and the Pixel line and a lot of the other manufacturers that have always-on displays have done always-on displays and have done it right from the beginning and haven't really tweaked it. Hopefully Apple can make some tweaks or make it a little bit better, or I guess just make the layout a little bit more convenient for most people. And I may be in the minority when it comes to the always-on display and my thoughts on the always-on display, but I just feel like the information isn't easy to see. And I just want Apple to kind of lower all that information into the middle of the screen. My final thoughts on the phone is, my recommendation at least is, if you're looking to upgrade your phone, if you're on an iPhone 12 or older, you definitely should upgrade. If you're on an iPhone 13 Pro Max or iPhone 13 in general, I don't know if this is a worthy upgrade. In my opinion, I went from an iPhone 13 Pro Max to this, and not too far into the whole process, I just felt like this wasn't a huge upgrade. I don't know if it's a huge upgrade for a lot of people. But again, if you're on an iPhone 12 or older, or if you're on an iPhone SE and you want more features or better camera, better processor, then the iPhone 15 Pro Max and Pro may be what you're looking for. But for most people, the iPhone 13 or newer, and if you're especially on the iPhone 14 or 14 Pro, Pro Max, the upgrade is definitely not necessary. You're not really getting a whole lot with the exception of the Tetraprism telephoto lens and titanium. And really, one of the biggest new features for me was USB-C. But other than that, you don't really need it. But am I happy with the phone overall? Absolutely. It's just what I expected. USB-C has probably been one of my favorite features because I have USB-C all around my house, and now I can just plug it in anywhere I am. I have USB-C in my car. Again, just plug it in. It's no big deal. I do still have some lightning gadgets in the house, but again, being able to just charge my iPhone 15 Pro Max anywhere I need, and if I do need to, has been super, super convenient. But either way, that's going to wrap it up. If there's anything I missed or anything that you want to know about the iPhone 15 Pro Max, please leave a comment. If you liked this video, like it. If you didn't like it, dislike it. But if you really, really liked it, hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching, and you have a good day.